So what have you done with regard to the regulatory framework here in the U.S.?
I've done a lot over the years.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for, since 1998. So I've testified before Congress before in front of the U.S. Small Business Committee on Entrepreneurship for the Senate. I've submitted testimony multiple times to both the House Committee and the Senate Committee. I've lobbied the trade associations. Funny, SBA 504 never used to be able to allow for refinancing commercial real estate. I was the first guy that was pushing for that. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, there's legislation that would bump the SBA 7A max from 5 to 10 million. That's something I've been pushing for a couple years now. During PPP, we were the 6th most active PPP lender in the country, and I was at the very beginning dealing with who at the time was my senator in Florida, Marco Rubio, who was the chairman of the Senate Small Business Committee. And starting, I think it was March 9th, when President Trump came on from the Oval Office talking about COVID, and he said that he's going to have SBA offer $50 billion to saving America's small businesses. And I happened to be on the phone with someone I consider the SBA's media authority. And he's a good personal friend of mine. And we were on the phone, and my wife kind of comes out of my lanai and she says, I think you want to get off the phone with Bob and come in here and listen to the president's speech. I've already paused it, so you'll be able to watch it from the front. So I stay on the phone with him. I come back in, and we're watching it together. His wife had done the same thing. And we're watching it literally, second by second. And we get to this part where the president mentions SBA. I don't think the presidents of the United States has ever mentioned SBA in an Oval Office. So that alone was shocking to me.
Yeah.
But then he says 50 billion. And both my friend and I were like, did he say million or billion? And I rewound, and we played it again, turned it up. No, it was billion. Well, the irony here is 2-3 weeks later, that 50 billion turned into 254 billion. And that was just the first round of PPP. Eventually, PPP got up to 796 billion, I believe is the number. So it was a massive, it was the largest, governmental program dedicated exclusively to what I think is the backbone of America, which is small businesses. Nobody even got anything close to that. To put things in perspective, Paul, the average SBA budget annual lately has approached about 30 billion.
Okay.
So this is, 20, 25 times what SBA's ever done in its best year is what they pushed through. So bottom line is, I was talking with Senator Rubio at that time, because I knew his staff very well, and I'd go up to Washington and lobby for a lot of different reforms over the years. And we started talking about this program, which came out of a think tank, and we started discussing it, and we were on many, many calls from that point forward, talking about, what is it gonna look like? And there was a lot of suggestions made by myself and my CFO and my COO at the time that they listened to. A lot of they didn't, and the biggest one that they didn't, frankly, is that they didn't listen to what is a fundamental tenet of SBA lending, which is, and at this point, all commercial lending, which is to get tax transcripts on the tax returns that you're given, whether it's business tax returns or personal tax returns. And I was pretty adamant, how can we make an SBA loan without having tax transcripts to validate the financials that are submitted to us?
Yep.
And I remember distinctly, I don't remember if it was Senator Rubio or one of his legislative directors who said, look, we're just trying to get the money out the door as quick as we can. We'll clean that stuff up later. And I said, well, you're going to have 10 or 15% fraud if we don't do this. And they said, well, we'll deal with that later. And I was pretty prophetic in that that's what we've dealt with. Yeah. Now, it hasn't been as bad in PPP as the program that SBA administered directly, which is the EIDL. That's when, if there's a tornado in rural Kansas, FEMA comes in, but so does SBA. SBA is actually writing checks to those folks. Well, this is the most EIDL had ever done, and it was administered directly from SBA employees and their contractors. And if you read the headlines, the fraud in that is a lot worse than in PPP. So it was a crazy time for sure.
So you folks were the 6th largest?
6th most active. Yeah, we did just under $5 billion, and we did close to 300,000 PPP loans. Yeah.
During the height of that, how many of those were you doing per day?
I can't remember units, but I will tell you that in 2021, we had to keep bumping up our lenders' ability to actually ACH or wire funds, and we went from a daily ACH limit or wire limit of 25 million, we got it up to 175 million a day. So there was probably 9 or 10 days there where we were pushing out $175 million a day, which is extraordinarily nerve-wracking, by the way.
The SBA is not writing these checks. Where are you getting this money to lend?
So that was another aspect that I did, which is we actually leaned on the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve created what they called the Paycheck Protection Program Liquidity Facility, the PPPLF. And it was part of the regulation that came out that they were going to do this. The problem is they enabled it for depository lenders, meaning banks, credit unions, and they mentioned that they would do it for non-depositories, but they hadn't done it right out of the gate. Because if you think about it, they were producing money out of effectively thin air.
Correct.
It doesn't matter how big you are, you didn't have enough cash on your balance sheet to be able to push these loans out. Even just basic lenders needed this facility to help them. Well, the problem is, there's a guy like me and a bunch of other folks out there who are non-bank lenders who are approved by SBA to make loans, and this is an SBA program, and we don't have enough liquidity to make these loans.
And you can't tap into the Fed.
Well, we couldn't at the time, and I started lobbying the Fed left and right, and it was pretty ridiculous. I almost had like a mind map of, okay, I've talked to the Fed in Atlanta. I knew somebody who's in Pensacola, one of the branches. I got somebody in Jacksonville. I had this ridiculous mind map, and I'm calling these people daily, in addition to me in the trenches processing these loans and keeping my staff focused and worried that we're all going to get the COVID and die. All these types of things are going on. But eventually, it was interesting. I was my only downtime during that period. I was working about 20 hours a day, like no bullshit, 7 days a week for months at a time. But my only solace every morning.
You look way healthier now, by the way. You did that. I remember back in those days.
Well, I lost like 40 pounds in April of 2020. I mean, it was crazy. Yeah. My wife and my chief of staff were like feeding me, like sliding, the metaphorical tray under the door to make sure I ate. But what I would do every day just to keep my energy up is I had a sauna on my lanai, and I would go in my sauna and I'd just try to keep up on something, read or whatever. And ironically, I'm going to geek out on you for a second. I actually had an ABA, an American Bankers Association white paper that I found, and I was flipping through it in the sauna one morning. And this is, by the way, I would sauna at like 6 in the morning and then hustled to the office. Later, we would work from home. But there was a section describing the emergency powers of the Federal Reserve, and one of the things that they said in there, and I'm not going to quote it directly, but it was basically in an economic crisis, the Fed could utilize its emergency powers to offer funding even to non-depository institutions like what we were. And this had previously only been contemplated like if there was a huge crop shortage or something, and there was a farmer's bank or something that couldn't do it. But they'd never lent to a non-depository before. And I seized on those like 2 or 3 sentences and immediately went to town. And I was dealing with folks on Capitol Hill. I was dealing with folks within SBA because SBA had a vested interest to make sure that these loans got out there and helped save America's small businesses. So they were pushing, and there was a guy at SBA who would have meetings daily most of April and into early May with his counterparties at the Federal Reserve. I was calling on them. We're coming at all angles on this. Eventually, the chairman of the Federal Reserve announces that, okay, now they're ready to roll it out. And we had already prepped all the paperwork ahead of time because it's a big process to go through this. And it was very gratifying to be the very first non-depository to actually have our paperwork in and to make the first PPP loan, or any loan for that matter, from a non-depository borrowing from the Federal Reserve. And we actually
fresh cash conjured out of thin air, right to your doorstep.
Exactly. And we had to sort of teach the Federal Reserve what this means and how to administer this. And it was mostly my CFO and I at the time, and it was a little crazy. We were dealing with the Minneapolis district feds for some odd reason, but yeah, a lot of our best practices that we were teaching them, they then would utilize for other non-depositories at the time. And it was, but yeah, I mean, like you said, we literally created money out of thin air, and but I'm glad we did, because I mean there's been fraud, and there's a bunch of people that should have never gotten the funds. They were able to dupe lenders. I think lenders in general did the best they could. Nobody came out and taught us exactly, somebody from the FBI said, okay, you're getting ready to make these PPP loans. Here's all the things that you need to look for. We literally we had a working document. It was very fluid that we were constantly adding like things that we would notice that were clearly fraudulent attempts. And that document within our staff got up to like 15 or 18 items by the end of it. And it was, we were doing things to uncover illegality that nobody ever taught us to. We're bankers, for God's sake.